Good evening. My name is Allison Powers, and I am the staff support for the Resident and Associate Society of the American College of Surgeons. Welcome to tonight's Grand Rounds webinar on contract negotiations. It's being brought to you by the Resident and Associate Society's Education Committee. And here to introduce our speaker and also the committee is Dr. Madhuri Nagaraj. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Napier, who will be speaking to us tonight regarding contract negotiations for the second session in our RAS ACS Financial Literacy Lectureship. This is a session that was brought about by Dr. Ritter and a few of us that's supposed to help guide a lot of us who are less aware of financial literacy as surgeons and help us guide us along the process. And Rebecca will be speaking to us tonight specifically about contract negotiations. Along with this session, thank you again for signing up, comes a primer that we've put together that you will either be emailed tomorrow, or if you take a look in the GoToWebinar control panel on the left, you may be able to download it from the handout section. So Rebecca Napier has both her Bachelor's of Business Administration and her Master's of Business Administration, amongst many other accolades, and has since been working for over 20 years as an innovative financial and operations executive. I had the pleasure of working with her through our UT Southwestern Department of Surgery for quite some time, where she was our Chief Business and Operations Administrator, and has now moved on to work with the best merchant partners. Amongst her many fortes include operations management, as well as a lot of research in emotional intelligence and leadership. And I have personally heard this talk before and had to have her speak on our behalf. So I hope you guys all enjoy this and learn something from Ms. Napier tonight. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me tonight. And we'll go through the presentation, and then at the end, we'll have the opportunity to take some questions. I'm really excited to share this, as you know, having sat on the other side of the table for negotiations, I know how stressful they can be. You know, my colleagues in healthcare often talk about the challenges of negotiations and how they work. And so at UT Southwestern, this was a session that I did with our graduating fellows, and we decided it would be an opportunity to share with you all. So first up, I have nothing to disclose. And then I think we'll just jump right into sort of a general overview of some of the items that you may want to look at. So as you're considering, you know, different position opportunities, they may be located in various cities across the country, and sometimes it's hard to ascertain whether a job in Cleveland versus a job in San Antonio at the same salary really is the same salary. And so there's some tools that are online, and there's some links to that in this presentation that will help you be able to look at, you know, the salaries and the cost of living to where you can be able to do, you know, a real-time comparison, as well as, you know, looking at the community that you're considering from a variety of things, even, you know, commuting time and the resources available in the community, the crime rates and so forth. So these are all important factors as you're considering your negotiations, and you want to be thinking about these things. Also, as a lot of the residents and fellows that I would work with, when they would get that first contract, you know, there was often, you know, an opportunity for them to engage an attorney, and the attorney would spend a whole lot of time marking up the contract and making recommendations for, you know, changes and so forth. And I think it's pretty important to understand, you know, what a role for an attorney is. I think, you know, when you're looking at these contracts, a lot of them are fairly boilerplate. And so when you consider that these employment agreements are often for, you know, hundreds of other faculty or practice associates, that, you know, you're not going to have unique contracts for each of these individuals. So, you know, a lot of times you can spend your money with an attorney best at really diving into what is it legally obligating you to, you know, what is this contract requiring of you? And then, you know, for some of the language changes, you know, there may be some minor opportunities for changes, but most people have already adjudicated their contracts to a degree that they're not really wanting to make significant changes. I think a lot of times we look at attorneys when really I think you can also get a lot of benefit from engaging a financial planner or an accountant at this phase, because not all contracts line up exactly the same. And so when you're looking at your contributions to your retirement or partnership arrangements or other items, a lot of times a financial planner or an accountant that's familiar in this space can be incredibly useful and help you figure out some of the areas where you may wish to negotiate. And that's something that's often overlooked as I see individuals as they're looking through these contracts. And then the last thing, I think it's really important for you to know your benchmarks. So we're going to talk about those a little bit more specifically related to the different types of employers. But there are benchmarks out there for productivity as well as salary, and really having a good handle on that information is important. And at your institution, the administrator for your department actually has access to a lot of these benchmarks, because many of our institutions already utilize these, and through the different associations that we belong to have that data. And so it's often a good time to reach out to what Dr. Nagaraj mentioned, my role at UT Southwestern, many times I would sit down with the fellows or residents and literally walk them through the various benchmarks that were being referenced in their offer letters. But that's sort of a little bit of the background and some big picture things that you may want to consider. So let's start with negotiating your first employment offer. And this is, a new offer. And I will say we're going to break this into two parts. We're going to look at academic medical center jobs, and then we're going to look at private practice. And I would say that when you're looking at academic medical center jobs, you're going to see some similarities between your state institutions and then your private institutions. And so some of these things will apply more or less to the other, and we'll talk about some of that. But I think anytime you're entering into a negotiation, it's always important to know who's going to be the decision maker, because you may not always be facing that individual. And if that's not the case, then you really need to think about how that's structured. And so, a lot of times when, new faculty were being hired, I had a component that I was responsible for related to comp and ensuring equity and so forth, as well as the chair or the division chief, had a role in negotiating comp. And, I don't know that was always apparent to the individuals that were interviewing with us. And so I think once, that is fully understood, then it helps you be able to know who to reach out to with some of your questions. I think when you look at academic medical center jobs, it's usually led by the department and typically the chair or chief. And there's some exceptions for this. There are certain roles or positions within an organization where they may engage like the dean's office or other areas of leadership to assist with that negotiation, because it's considered a critical position. And then I think one of the other things you need to look at too is who is your employer. I think we all think, oh, it's going to be the university, but a lot of times universities have a practice plan in which you're technically employed by, which is part of the university, but it often allows you better benefits or different benefits. So understanding that you may be employed by the university, you may be employed by the practice plan, or you may actually be employed by both. I've seen that from other universities, and I think it's just critical to know who it is that is hiring you, because that may change some of the ways your position is structured, especially as you're looking at your promotion pathway and other opportunities to negotiate your salary. And then academic medical centers more often than not use the AAMC benchmarks, but many of them have begun blending these with MGMA data. MGMA is more commonly used for private practice, but as institutions are really gearing towards that clinical revenue, there is some blending that we're seeing as a trend when we're talking about benchmarks. And this is both for your productivity as well as your salary. And then I think when you look at academic medical center jobs, you're going to see a lot more ambiguity with your position structure. Your job requirements may not necessarily be spelled out as clearly. Your days on call or your number of service days or your clinic times or your OR may not be specifically listed in your contract or your letter of intent for an academic medical center job, but you often see those when you're negotiating for a private practice or a private hospital position. And so I think that's important to understand, that when you're looking at your contract and you're comparing it to one of your colleagues, you've got to recognize who is going to be their employer versus who is going to be yours. Because often I'll have individuals come with their friend and say, hey, they got a contract that says this, and my contract doesn't talk about any of this. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong, one is good and one is bad. It's just it's what you more commonly see. And then we talk a lot in initials or use jargon that doesn't always translate well to somebody who doesn't live this every day. A lot of us forget that this is maybe the first time that you're negotiating a contract. And so we start talking about things like LOIs or offer letters, and what does that really mean? And so that is exactly an offer letter is exactly what you think it is. It's that offer of employment. An LOI is just another way to say that. It's a letter of intent. Neither of these are actually a contract, and often in academic medical centers, contracts come much later. Part of that is because you often are given a letter of intent or an offer letter that outlines what they're planning to offer you. But for anybody who's coming in a role that's not at an assistant professor level, a lot of times they have to go through the P&T, the promotion and tenure process. See, I'm even using initials here when I know better, and I'm sure you all know what P&T stands for, but still, the promotion and tenure process to ensure that if you're going to be offered perhaps an associate professor level job, that you'll pass through the committee with the approval, and because that can often change what your starting salary would be. But it's important to understand that offer letter is truly just an offer letter, but yet we utilize those as truly our opportunity to notify you that we want to hire you, that is our plan. And as long as we're able to maneuver through the P&T process, the promotion and tenure process, and then pass the background check, you will end up with a contract. And so I think that's also important to understand as you're going through this first process. And then when you're looking at private practice, instead of the chair, recruitment is often directed by a recruiter. This is incredibly common. And it may be a recruiter that works for the organization, or it may be an external recruiter that they contract with to do, all of the legal requirements, the background checks and all that stuff. And then typically a managing partner or, a hospital leader, if it's going to have a heavy supported role by, a community or other hospital, that you'll have, a physician individual involved in the recruitment process that's driving it. This contract sometimes doesn't even have an offer letter. You may go straight to the contract, and it's usually offered pretty early in the negotiation. Now, private practice tends to use a more variety of benchmarks, whether it's MGMA that we talked about earlier or society specific. There's Sullivan Cotter. There's a ton of different benchmarks out there. And, that's again where you can reach out to the administrator in your organization and see if they're familiar with these, or if any of their colleagues have access to the benchmarks, so you can look at them comparatively. And then typically in private practice, more so than across the board in your academic roles, pay is often directly tied to productivity, and you normally have a ramp up period, a guarantee period that ensures you're going to achieve a certain salary until a set point in time. But then it may even be a direct derivative of your RVU productivity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But in a private practice contract, you typically have greater clarity. Now I say typically, because it's not always the case, regarding your position structure. These are usually very specific about the number of days you're going to take call, what you're going to be paid for call if you are, or if it's some threshold if you go over a certain number of days. that you'll be paid for that. If you're going to have any, other responsibilities, and if there's compensation tied to those are really clearly spelled out when you're looking at private practice jobs. Like I said, there's always exceptions to everything. That's part of the challenge of negotiating your first contract or any contract, to be honest, is that, that there is, a lot of variability in them. But what I'm sharing with you all are some of the general tenets that tend to hold true over time. And so then, when you're looking at the contract itself, there's some of the items that, I really think is important to kind of dive in on. And I think I don't need to tell any of y'all that salary is, obviously a critical piece, but I also think you need to look at the term of the contract. And when I say the term of the contract, it's not just the length of time that you're being employed for, but what are the terms in regards to the notification if they're going to end your contract. So, you want to make sure that you clearly understand that and know that all of the items here on this list are things that could potentially be, negotiated. I mentioned that often, you start with a base guarantee in private practice and allows you to get to a productivity level. In the academic medical centers, you tend to have what we call a ramp up for your clinical activity, but it's often not, your compensation is not often directly tied to that. Typically your incentive is, or whether or not you're meeting your performance expectations, but it's not often a direct derivative, at least for your base salary. And even, the guarantee period or your ramp up period can be negotiated. So say, for instance, that you're looking at a community job and they're guaranteeing your salary for a year, but you're going into a practice where your position is an incremental add to the practice. So you're going to have to build volume, that there may be some volume that's already within the practice that needs to shift to this new role, but rarely do you have a full FTE covered if it's going to be, an additional incremental increase in the number of providers that are in this practice. And so, depending on your community or your market, you may want to extend or request to extend that guarantee beyond what they originally offered. And that's something that I've routinely seen. We saw one of the fellows at UT Southwestern, she had a contract that was offering her only a 1-year guarantee. The role was in a rural Texas community, and it was going to take quite a bit of time in order for her to be able to build a patient base. And so she actually was able to negotiate and extend that guarantee period for her base salary for 3 years. And so, that obviously was a substantial difference. And, the nice thing was that she not only negotiated to get it for 3 years, but if she did exceed it earlier, she would be eligible for the additional compensation. And so that really, put her at a much better advantage than if she had just accepted the starting guarantee. And very similar with the ramp up period. We see that, from 2 to 3 years, typically in, the academic community. And some institutions have it as a standard and all their faculty are exactly the same, and some it's really, by negotiation. So, I think it's important to understand that even that could be something that you discuss. Moving expenses, there was a point in time, if you talk to some of the faculty that you probably work with now, and they talk about moving expenses, that those were things that the institution covered and they never had to write the check for it, and it all flowed through the institution. Well, nowadays, because the federal government decided that the IRS decided that these are all going to be taxable, that we no longer tend to pay those on behalf of the employee or the recruit. Most places tend to offer a lump sum payment because all of this is taxable now, or you pay it and then submit receipts. UT Southwestern, speaking from the experience that I have from the organization, at the academic organization that I was most recently at, they did still provide that up front, or you could get the lump sum, or you could do, all of these other ways. So I think it's important to understand how the moving expenses are going to be paid out, and then to negotiate appropriately how much you need for moving expenses. And then, when it comes to signing bonuses, you're going to see them as a variety of different things. A lot of places don't call them signing bonuses because of, some of the stigma that goes along with it. I've seen them from, you know, a one-time administrative compensation. I've seen them as a forgivable note. And what I mean by forgivable note is they would, you know, pay you, say, $30,000 as your signing bonus, but do it as a forgivable note. And then each year that you're there, they would forgive 1/3 of that note. So that $30,000 you were given, that if you left after the first year, you would only have to pay back 20,000 of it because they forgave that first 10,000. After the second year, they'd forgive another 10,000, and then after the third year, they'd forgive another 10,000, to where you basically got a signing bonus, but they did it as though it were a loan. And I think it's important to know that there's some tax consequences that come along with this too. So again, a good plug for why you would want to talk to a financial advisor, because in those instances, that's not considered, you know, a signing bonus until it's actually forgiven. So you'll have a tax liability in year 1, year 2, and year 3 of $10,000 versus $30,000 when you actually receive the money. So it's a little bit different and can be, you know, can be challenging to try to get your arms around. And then, you know, there are, you know, you see this commonly in the private side of the world is tuition forgiveness. So if you have a lot of student loans that you can negotiate for, you know, those to be paid off, you can negotiate your RVU expectations. That same individual who negotiated a longer guarantee period also was able to negotiate a different dollar per work RVU expectation, which increased her salary. And so, you know, being able to understand those components and how it all fits together to make up your compensation is really important, because again, all of these things are things that you can talk with them about. And then similarly with your call requirements, your coverage expectations, whether you're on backup call or whatever, you can negotiate the number of days, you can negotiate the compensation and so forth. Now, you know, a lot of times in academics, we include that as part of the base salary, and so we don't specify that. Remember how I talked about that in the private practice, you tend to see more specificity to those contracts than you do in the academic world. And so you're gonna see, you know, sort of correlating ability to negotiate in those spaces related to, you know, how specific they are about that. And then, you know, protected time in the academic world, you know, if you want to do, you know, research, you need to be able to have the protected time to do that. And so being able to understand how your distribution of effort, whether it's clinical, it's research, or, you know, education, whatever it is, understanding that that protected time can also potentially be negotiated. You need to know your local market. You know, it may be that you're in a state where compensation is at one level, but because of competition within the local market, the compensation may be at a higher level. And so getting a good understanding of that's really important. And then making sure that you know the compensation structure and how that is paid out is really a critical piece too, because you know, you can miss out on opportunities if you're not aware of how your compensation is being structured. And then, you know, your other benefits are also important as well. So the cost of your insurance, your provider contributions, all of these things go into affect what your bring home is. And you know, in the academic world, or when you're employed by a large organization such as like HCA, you're going to have pretty structured benefits and contributions. But, you know, again, in smaller group practices, I've even seen, you know, the retirement contributions negotiated and so forth. So even these are some other items to consider. And then, you know, your academic allotment or your professional development funds. A lot of times in the academic world, these again are structured, but you know, in private practice, you may have some opportunity to receive some of these funds, and you may need to negotiate those as well. You know, in large organizations, you're going to see more structured leave period, and you know, you'll need to understand whether you've got paid leave for, you know, some of these items, or whether it's unpaid leave, and being sure that you get a clear understanding of all of those. And then getting a good handle on your promotion and tenure requirements are going to be really important as well as you go into a new job. So some of the things that I think can be really helpful is to try to gain as much advanced knowledge before you start your negotiation as possible. Befriend the me. or the recruiter, because a lot of times we have really good inside information and can often help you understand which components are the most likely that our organization would be the one would be willing to negotiate. And then talk to people who've recently managed this process. One of the questions that I always love when fellows ask new faculty is like, what did you wish you'd asked before you signed your contract? What's something that you regret not knowing now that if somebody could go back and tell you would be incredibly helpful? But be mindful that the recruitment process and the culture does change over time. And so if you're talking to somebody who was recruited even 5 years ago, that may not be as relevant. And so some of those junior faculty are really key to kind of get inside, get an inside scoop on how to do this. And then, make sure you understand which benchmarks are used by their organization, because sometimes they don't even tell you what they're benchmarking to. They just, quote an RVU expectation, quote a salary. But typically most organizations benchmark these salaries and productivity expectations to a national database. And so if you understand which one it is, it makes it a lot easier to negotiate, because you can understand whether they're trying to pay you at the 5th percentile, the 25th percentile, or the 75th percentile, because that really will change how you go about negotiating your salary. And then, understand how they go about cost of living increases and how it may or may not apply to, your position within the organization. So some institutions don't do cost of living adjustments, that they only increase your salary truly based on your productivity, whether it's academic productivity, whether it's clinical productivity, whatever it is. But just, kind of have an idea of whether or not they do these adjustments periodically. And then I would want to know my employer flexibility. So if they have certain areas where they really expect you to negotiate, then I think it's really important that you've got to come in and ask for these things. And then if there are some areas that they're not going to move on, and this in advance, you're not having to waste the time or credibility, capital of asking for something that they're going to say no to. And then I think, something that's really helpful is knowing the salary culture. It may surprise you, or it may not, but Harvard versus Cleveland Clinic, or, the University of Iowa, they all have very different philosophies around their salary culture. And if you talk to any of their administrators, they can kind of tell you, what they do. There are some that start every single new faculty member at the 25th percentile, period. And then there are some that they know because they have to be really competitive. Maybe they're not as geographically optimized, or maybe they don't have quite the same cachet. Then they know they're going to have to pay at a higher level. So they may start out more towards the 50th percentile. But you don't want to be negotiating with an institution that is, a 25th percentile and expecting 50 or 75th, and vice versa for a place that will typically pay higher. You don't want to come in and start too low. So I think getting to know the salary culture is really important. And then when, we talk about the actual negotiation, I think this is one thing that I cannot emphasize enough. That, once they offer you an LOI or share with you a contract, you're not going to get one single additional thing if you do not ask for it. So if you take the contract just as accepted, then you may miss out on some opportunities. Now, I say this and want you to balance all of this information, because this is your potential new employer's first impression of you. So I want you to really navigate this very thoughtfully. And I will promise you that, especially as you're coming in, if you're first out of training, it is really difficult to successfully navigate a negotiation if you're offering ultimatums. And sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing it. But, I think you just need to be really careful about how you ask for things. And I think you absolutely should ask for things. Now I say that, but it's also okay to let them know what deal breaker items are. So, if your work-life balance, you really have an expectation that you don't want to take more than 10 days of call per month, then I think you need to tell them that you're looking for a job that does not have more than 10 days of call per month, and they've got you, scheduled to do 15 according to your contract. So I think, these things are, okay to talk to them about, and you've got to, but, it's easier if you don't, as I like to say, you don't throw down the gauntlet and say, we can't do this, because a lot of times you can get them exactly where you need to be, but in a way that is much more appetizing to everybody involved. And I will tell you that you do not have to share everything that you know and all of the components of what's going on in your recruitment. Maybe you're talking to 2 or 3 organizations, but I would encourage you not to ever misrepresent the truth. And I don't think anybody ever intends to, but sometimes we get caught up in the moment. And so I think, this has been something that I've seen, especially the first time you're going through a negotiation, people say things that they kind of had to walk back later, and that can be really tough. But that being said, I think it's really important that, you can let them know that if you're being recruited by other institutions. And yes, that actually does help your negotiations. And, I would be careful when you do that. If it's a job that you're really wanting, then I would say, hey, the salary that you're offering me, I really appreciate it, but I've got maybe 2 other offers. And you don't have to tell them that they're the same or less, but I've got 2 other offers on the table, and I was really hoping that my salary could be, X plus $50,000. And is there any room for us to consider increasing that amount? Or, you can tell them, hey guys, I love your organization. This is really where I want to be, but I was expecting a salary of this amount, or I was really expecting a signing bonus of this amount. Is there any opportunity to negotiate that? So you're not telling them no, and you're not turning down their offer, but you are opening the door to really have these conversations. And depending on, how many other opportunities you have, how much you really want this position, or have concerns about whether or not this is the job, how softer or firmer that I would be with that negotiation. If you've got 3 great offers and you really don't care which city you live in, and you want to try to leverage one for the most money, go for it. But if you have a place that you're really trying to get to, and you just want to make sure that you're getting the optimized offer as you should, then you want to strategically do this a little bit softer. And it doesn't mean you can't still get to the same place. It just may take a little bit longer. And then I'll also tell you, be sure you prioritize your requests, because when you start the negotiation period, if I ask for more salary, more moving expenses, more signing bonus, greater this, greater that, less call, then I'm probably not going to get all of that. But if there are a few things that are really critical to me, that's where I would really hone in on. Now, I will say I've seen time and again where people are really keen to push the signing bonus, because that's money today. And I understand that, especially as you're coming out of training and you have the desire to buy a house and all this other stuff. But you have to remember that, a lot of times when you negotiate more upfront money, it precludes you from being able to ask for quite as much enduring salary support. So, if say we offered you a starting salary of $300,000 and a $30,000 signing bonus, and you really wanted $350,000 for your salary and a $50,000 signing bonus, I probably would focus a lot more on that additional $50,000 for my salary, because that's every single year, versus $20,000 for that signing bonus, unless I really needed it. Doesn't mean you can't try to do both, but just be mindful of the fact that they may try to counter offer by going with one versus the other. And a lot of times you'll see that they'll choose the one that'll cost them the least money, which is the upfront. And so they'll tell you that, I'll meet you on the upfront request, but for your base salary, we're only going to be able to increase it by a much smaller number. And so I think, you just need to think through what's the most important thing to you. And again, use those benchmarks. Those are going to be really helpful as you're negotiating your salary. Now, when you talk about negotiating salary, we've been focusing completely on, you coming in new to an organization. But, once you've been there, there's going to come a point in time where you need to renegotiate your salary in your current position. I think some of the key things to remember is to always know the timeline of when these decisions are made. And I can tell you that for any salary change that was done outside the budget process, the scrutiny was always tenfold of what it was during the budget process. And I think it's really important to know that, because if you can get it during the normal cycle and get the approval without having to use that political capital, that's great, because that's something that you can save to use for another day. And then one of the other things that I think is important when you go to negotiate a higher salary, it's important to leave other people out of it, because you don't always know what else that person is tasked to do or why their salary is what it is. I would negotiate a fair rate for yourself. And you do that by using the data, using benchmarks, and so forth. Now, I will add to this that when you leave other people out of it, I'm not saying that if there's a gender inequity that you don't address that, but I would address the gender specifically, not say that, Peter and Paul get paid $20,000 more than I do, and so you're being unfair to me. I would approach it from a global gender equity issue and say, I do think there's a gender equity or a gender inequity when it comes to salaries, and I think we need to address that. Why don't we sit down and talk about how we can get my salary up to the appropriate levels? And I think that works out a lot better than when you start, naming names and pitting your salary against other individuals. I've seen that not work out so well for individuals. And then, there is something that you can do regarding, leverage. If you're somebody who has been producing well in an organization, or are in a critical service line, or there's a staff shortage, or you just are a key member of the team, leverage an external offer. Go out there and interview, but know if you're not getting any success doing some of these other things, but know that you can only do this once. But I also would make sure I understood the climate and culture of your organization, because some people will find this incredibly off-putting. And so you just need to understand that before you do it. But even if your organization tends to counter outside offers, know that that's usually a card that you can only play once. And when I say that, that doesn't mean if you're there for 20 years, you can't ever do it again, but it's not something that you can do every couple of years. And, there's still a little bit of finesse to doing it. It's very similar to how when you are first getting your offers, kind of leveraging one against the other. I'd go to my boss and say, hey, I really love working here and I really want to stay, but I'm being offered this elsewhere. And so that way it doesn't commit you to leave, but lets them know that you're in high demand in the market. And then I think it's really important too to try to find advocates or allies that'll promote you. And when I say that, I don't mean promote you in the tenure, the associate assistant, et cetera, but will promote you to, the leadership and say, hey, pay attention to Dr. Fill in the blank. She's really, or he's really working hard. And I don't know that, we're addressing that. I'm worried about them leaving, or we need to make sure their comp is fair. And find those people that aren't directly responsible for your salary and have them advocate for you too. I've seen that work incredibly effectively. And it can even be your department administrator. I had a division chief come to me and was concerned about her salary and was struggling with how to negotiate for it. And so I actually, on her behalf, went to the decision maker for this position and said, hey, she's not going to come to you because she feels really uncomfortable, but her salary isn't, equivocal to her peers. What should we do about this? And so, you can find allies in the most unlikely of places. So don't be afraid to use those. And then I think I already touched on the gender, but I also would be, when you're doing this, be concise and direct, and then ask for follow-up. You don't need to belabor it. You need to just put it out there and, let them know what you expect. And I think that goes, a long way with being able to successfully navigate that negotiation. Now, the last thing that I'm going to offer is, I talked to you a little bit about finding advocates and allies and working with the resources that you know. I'm also going to offer 2 other individuals, and you're also welcome to contact me. I think you all have my contact information if you have questions. But Jonathan Radin's at the University of Colorado, and he spent a lot of his career doing negotiations on behalf of an institution. He used to actually be over that office for their entire university. And so he spent a lot of time in the space of contract negotiations. He's done a talk before at UT Southwestern for our residents around negotiations, and he's a great guy to reach out to, and has given me permission to provide his phone number. That's his cell phone number and his email address, and you're welcome to talk to him. And then Megan Berlinger, she actually is a healthcare recruiter. And, she is somebody who looks at hundreds of contracts every week and helps clients navigate their offers. Now, she works for the institutions. So as, a new, somebody newly leaving or being hired in an organization, she understands that this may be the first time you're doing this. So she actually offers up the opportunity for you to reach out to her as well. She was previously at Wake Forest and has experience both in the private as well as public. And so she can be a great resource for you too. These 2 people just, offer it and volunteer it, but there's no requirement for you to, there's no expectation if you do reach out to them. And they'll try to help you navigate, any questions that you may have, or you want somebody who's completely impartial and can give you some additional insight. And then, as I said, you're always welcome to reach out to me too. It's important that you feel like you've got a network of people that are available for you. And now we're at the end of the prepared information, and I want to be able to answer any questions that you all may have. So I am going to turn this over to our moderators, so that way we can get these questions going.
Thank you so much. So as you guys are starting to think about your questions, please do type them in the Q&A panel on the left side of your screen. I'll tell you a little bit about the Grand Rounds webinar series. We have probably 75 to 80 pre-recorded sessions that are posted on the ACS website for members like you to view and to learn from. They cover topics from financial literacy, as this series is, burnout, and all types of a host of topics. So please do look for this recording to be added to that arsenal in the next week. And as Dr. Nagash said earlier, please do access the primer that comes along with tonight's webinar. So we do have a question. And the first one talks about negotiating with a place where this individual is unfamiliar with the culture and what is considered normal or negotiable in that institution. So how would this individual find out that information to help in the negotiation process without seeming like he's trying to be too hard-headed?
Sure. I think a great way to do it is just by asking questions. And so, a lot of times I've seen people reach out and say, hey, I had some questions about my contract. It's just some of the nitty-gritty stuff that I need somebody to explain to me because this is my first time doing it. Who would be best for me to talk to? And so then when you ask it that way, most people want to help you. And so they'll walk through and explain to you, this is what this is this component. I do this, I used to do this all the time. And, it got to the point where when I would interview somebody, because I was part of the interview process, when I would interview somebody who this was their first job out of training, I actually walked them through, just like I did with you guys, the different components of the, like the contract and the things that are negotiable and the things that they can, the things that are the UT never evers, or I was previously at the University of Kentucky, did the same thing there. The University of Kentucky never evers. I mean, we're never going to change where the contract is indemnified. It's just what it is. We're never going to change, you know, the period, the length of the time the contract is. You know, there's some things that you're just not going to change. And then I would tell them that, you know, these are some of the things that, you know, are negotiable. Or you can even ask, you know, is salary negotiable? You know, is that something y'all do? But you need to find somebody who's that person who will answer your questions. And so that's a great place to go for that. And you might even say, is there an administrator or a business person that can walk me through this, so that way I can ask them my questions? Because, you know, a lot of times we're a little less, we're used to doing this all the time, and so we're a little more comfortable with it. And I think that makes it easier, because sometimes if you're not as familiar with a contract, or you're not sure what's negotiable, like if you're talking to another one of the faculty members, they may tell you a wrong answer and not mean to. They may say, oh, you can't negotiate anything, and maybe it's because they didn't negotiate anything, and so they wouldn't necessarily understand that. So that would be a way that I think is easiest to go about, is to actually ask the question of who can answer my questions. And so once you start with them, you can even ask those questions of, okay, so is this something that I can negotiate? I was expecting a different salary, or, you know, whatever else. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Our next question, what are some ways that you would suggest to go to the local market and see how competitive it is?
So getting the benchmarks is a starting point. You can, you know, look at them regionally instead of, we tend to look at it nationally, because, you know, like at the two organizations that I was at previously, we recruited nationally, and so we looked at the national benchmarks. I would look at the cost of living in the community. That gives you a little bit of a clue as to, you know, the salary differentials. But then I would also look at the number of hospital systems that are there. And the more hospital systems that are there, the more providers that are in the community. If you're going into private practice, it'll have a reverse effect. You'll have greater competition for the job, so you'll have a lower salary. But if you have a lot of private folks and you're going to the academic institution, you often have the reverse, you know, challenge of where, because private practice can pay more, the institution sometimes has to negotiate a little bit differently. So those are some of the different ways that I would look at that local market when you're starting to decide whether it's competitive, you know, how competitive it is or not.
Thank you. And our next question, can you touch briefly on how government jobs differ and what would be negotiable in those contracts?
So when you're talking about a job like the VA, if I'm reading into this, it depends, and that's not always the easy answer. That's why I said, you know, if contract negotiations are never easy, because there's not like a set way that you can always do this. Because even with the VA, even with the government, there can be some differentials, because a lot of times you may have a joint appointment at an academic medical center. That's common. And so then you may have the academic medical center making up the salary differential for your market, or you may not. They may pay straight at the VA rate. And so, you know, just because the VA does have a pay scale doesn't mean that, you know, you can only get that salary. The other thing that I didn't touch on that I probably should have, and this brings it up, is that there are other things that you may want to negotiate besides the pure contractual things. So maybe you want an APP, or maybe you want a research tech, or, you know, perhaps you want to change, you know, your FTE or whatever else. Some of these things don't need to be in the contract. So if you want an APP and you want that as part of your negotiation and they verbally agree to it, you don't need to get it written into the contract, and most places won't even do that. So don't waste your time. But what I would do is make sure it's in writing, because what you can do, an easy way to do it, is send that follow-up email to the person who agreed and make sure that they are a decision maker. And say, hey, it was great talking with you today. I want to make sure that I've got everything correct. So here's what I understood. Please, if there's anything that needs to be adjusted, just let me know. And so you can send them back basically all the stuff that they agree to verbally, and you can put it in writing instead of asking them, hey, can you get this in writing? Because I will say that, you know, being in institutions, even if we have the best intent to honor whatever we say verbally, you know, you're not always, that person doesn't always stay. I was at UT Southwestern for 7 years, and there are a lot of things that I gave verbal approval of, but I also, would go back, and many of those I would put in writing. But I'll say that there are times that people would leave my office and I got busy and didn't send the follow-up email. So if they sent it to me, it really allowed me the opportunity to, make any clarifying comments or anything else. And so now that I'm gone, if they are no longer, that commitment's no longer being honored because somebody didn't realize it was a legacy thing, they can print off that email and take it into the new person and say, hey, Rebecca agreed to this, so we really need to commit to this. And so that helps you and goes a long way. It keeps you from having to basically negotiate the same thing twice. But that being said, even at the VA, research time is something that I commonly see negotiated there. Having the support around the research is something else, or again, that blended with the academic medical center to have some opportunity for salary makeup. There's a whole lot of different things that you can look at when you're coming to a VA contract. And if you are negotiating a government contract, if you want, I'm not probably the best person to help you know all of those things, but I do know people that are, and so I'm happy to try to connect you with somebody too. So if you want to shoot me an email, I'll be more than happy to share that with you as well.
Thank you. Do you have any advice in trying to negotiate from a full-time to a part-time contract?
Oh, I think a lot of it depends on the organization. A lot of times people, when they're in a very busy organization and they're short-staffed, think that that's an impossible negotiation. But I will say, I've actually seen it go the other way, because, when you're short-staffed, you don't want to lose whatever resources that you have. And so a lot of times you'll actually be able to negotiate that down. And then, too, if productivity and volumes aren't quite where they should be, whether it's you or somebody else, that's an easy negotiation as well, of saying, hey, I really want to, instead of being a 1.0 FTE, I'd really rather be a 0.7 and have a day off each week. And this will help out my colleague who maybe doesn't have enough volume or whatever else, because I can shift some of my work to them, or however you want to do it. But just do keep in mind that when you change your FTE, usually your salary changes in accordance to that. And then a lot of times too, institutions will have a certain FTE requirement where you'll be full-time versus part-time, and that'll really change, your benefit structure, your retirement contributions and everything. So when you go in to negotiate, make sure you know where that breakoff is, because if you want to still be a full-time employee, don't negotiate for a 0.7 if their threshold is 0.75. And so it's really important that when you go into that you understand that information. And then again, that financial advisor, talk to them about what the impact is going to be, not just on your salary, but also those other benefits as well. But I think just being upfront with people, and I would never paint it as I'm really unhappy with how I'm being treated, but state things like, I need more time away from work, or right now in my career, this is what I want. You don't have to explain it, and sometimes I think you do more harm than good than trying to explain. And I will say that as women, we tend to do that. We feel like we need to give a reason for why we want something in order to get it, and that's not always the case. Sometimes less is more.
Very good. Well, that ends the questions, although we do have a request for your contact information if you'd like to share that.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, I thought that was included, but I will, you can share my email information when you send out the presentation.
Okay.
And I'm happy, and share my cell phone number as well. And I'm happy to talk to anybody who has any questions, or find them a connection that's more appropriate for them as they try to navigate some of these complicated questions.
Great. And if you have any final comments, please share them now. Dr. Nagaraj, if you also have any final comments, please do share them. Otherwise, we're coming to the end of our webinar.
I would just like to say, obviously, I've listened to this before and I learn something new every time, but Rebecca's had given me incredible insight in how to handle this. And I think some of the key points that I hear is you're expected to negotiate, and that's part of our primer. So don't be afraid to. I think a lot of us are afraid to ask, but we're expected to do it. But there's still a way to do it gracefully and kindly, and I think she's given us great examples of how to do that. So I hope that between the talk and the primer and the fact that it'll be uploaded for you guys to access later will help you guys in the long term. Thank you again, Rebecca.
Well, I appreciate you all having me here. It's always nice to see you, whether in person or virtually. And I'm glad that there were good questions. So it said that maybe some of the information was useful, and I'm happy to hear you all dive into this topic, because it really is an important one to make sure that, you know, you're compensated at the right level and that have the right expectations. So well done.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Rebecca, and for your important information that you shared with us tonight. So until next time, good night and be well, everybody.